Welcome to Mount Sinai Rehabilitation and Human Performance. We stream smart healthcare information that's simple to understand so you can improve your health. I'm physical therapist Jimmy McKay, and I'll be your host. Today, we're answering your questions around concussion. To help us today is an associate professor in the Department of Rehabilitation and Human Performance, Dr. Carrie Esopenko, and Doctor of Physical Therapy and Clinical Director at the Abilities Research Center here at Mount Sinai, Dr. Jenna Tosto Mancuso. Doctors, welcome to the show. Carrie, we'll start with you. Let's answer the big question. What's a concussion? How do we define that?
Yeah, a concussion is biomechanical forces resulting from a direct blow either to the head, neck, or face or other parts of the body, basically causing the brain to move around within the skull. And this injury results in an alteration in mental status. And with concussion, not always a loss of consciousness, but typically we'll see things like feeling groggy or those issues with balance right after an injury or shaking the cobwebs out. That's usually a sure tail sign of a concussion.
Okay, thank you for that. Now that we know what a concussion is, what should we do about it? What should be done in the immediate short term after a concussion?
Yeah, as soon as we suspect or expect a concussion has happened, the first thing you want to do is seek medical attention. For our athletes, that's commonly seeing an athletic trainer on the sidelines. For people who don't have access to our athletic trainers, going directly to your medical professional and getting that diagnosed.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. There's an old thought that we should immediately rest and discontinue all activity after a concussion. Carrie, what do you say about that?
Yeah, we actually used to refer to that as cocoon therapy. And that was, an old consensus on treating concussions. First thing I will say is always follow your practitioner's recommendations. But with regard to rest, we typically say now that you want to, take a break for that first 24 to 48 hours after the injury, but then follow a graduated return to activities after the injury. And that, again, should be done with a healthcare practitioner.
Let's bring in Jenna. Jenna, what would happen if these warnings immediately after a concussion aren't followed?
Sure. So, like Dr. Esopenko started to tell us about, when you initially sustain a concussion, the brain is moving inside the skull. And so, what that typically results in is changes in the way our brain functions. So, on a normal occasion, our brain has a balance of things called neurotransmitters, which are means for communication within the brain, as well as utilization of things like glucose for energy. When you sustain a concussion, those typical functions are off balance, in addition to a number of other different processes in the brain change. And so, the goal of immediately after a concussion, taking the time to rest and progressively get back to activity allows the brain adequate time to rest and recover. If an individual goes back to activity or does not follow that progressive warning or those progressive steps for recovery, it puts the brain at a greater risk. And so, what we want to be cautious of is any of the potential side effects that could occur if a brain is at risk, which is not a situation we want to be in.
Yeah, we heard this term second impact syndrome. We've heard that term thrown around on national sports broadcasts. Jenna, how do you help us understand what second impact syndrome is?
Sure. So, second impact syndrome is quite like it sounds like a secondary impact. So, it is a secondary concussion or insult or injury to the brain in very close proximity to an original existing injury that's still in the process of recovering. And so, typically, what we see with second impact syndrome is an individual who is still in the process of recovering from their first concussion, sustains a second concussion, and now that brain is at even greater risk. And the symptoms and side effects and problems that could come from the first concussion are exacerbated or made to be potentially even worse.
Yeah, and following up on second impact syndrome, this is why we're always saying it's when in doubt, sit them out, because we don't want our athletes to hit their heads multiple times in a row. And we also really don't want them to hit their head while they're still recovering from that first injury. And the big thing with this to remember is that if you do sit out and you take the time to recover, then you're more likely to only miss a couple games versus the entire season if you hit your head back to back, among other worse things that can happen.
All right. Now, Jenna, the brain isn't the only part of the body affected when someone experiences concussion. The cervical spine can also be affected. Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. So, when we think about a concussion, like we started with our definition, the idea that a force, a biomechanical force, is imparted to the head and neck. And if we think about our basic anatomy, right, our head and our neck are in quite close proximity to one another. And so, what we find is oftentimes as that force is imparted upon the head, we see injuries to the cervical spine as well. And so, we know that there is a relationship in concussion symptoms, not only related to the effect on the head and the brain, but it can also be in relationship to the cervical spine or the upper neck.
It's interesting with the C spine or cervical spine. Many of the symptoms that we see with a neck injury also mimic concussion. So sometimes a neck injury can present like a concussion, or a concussion can look like a neck injury. So it's really important that we are differentiating between those two, as they will have different treatment options. And the other thing is that we've been showing in our lab that the neck and cervical strength is actually really important in symptom outcomes, as well as the wiring, protecting the wiring in the brain in individuals who hit their head a lot. So we know that the neck is very important.
Just another reason, sounds like that, Dr. Esopenko, just another reason to see a qualified healthcare provider after
Exactly.
a head injury. Dr. Esopenko, Dr. Tosto Mancuso, thanks so much for the insight. Find us at Mount Sinai Rehab on all major social platforms. This has been another Mount Sinai Rehabilitation and Human Performance live stream. We share smart healthcare information that's simple to understand so you can improve your health.